If we just give people a couple of minutes to join, then we should get started shortly. Okay. Perhaps if we can make a start, then maybe I think other people will join in the next couple of minutes as well. But good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where this finds you. And thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to join us for this event. We hope this will be the first in a series of UNIDIR public events focused on the upcoming Biological Weapons Convention Review Conference, which is scheduled for November 2021. Now, for many, that may seem a long time away and is perhaps understandably not an immediate focus for busy disarmament diplomats. However, the first part of the preparatory committee is scheduled for April and the second part for August, and April isn't that far away. So we sort of see it as being quite important for states to prepare for the review conference well in advance, so that states and stakeholders can make the most of this unique opportunity, both to take stock of the convention and to chart out a future strategic course for the Biological Weapons Convention over the coming years. Indeed, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, recently described this review conference as a critical forum for states parties to strengthen the BWC. So we really do need to seize this opportunity. To this end, UNIDIR is undertaking several BWC-related activities. This includes work on lessons learned from past review conferences. And as part of this, we're currently drafting a report on lessons learned from past review conferences, which will be available in the new year. This will also be designed to complement other events that we have provisionally planned for February and April. And with this sort of package of activities, what we're hoping to do is to stimulate early thinking and preparation for the 9th Review Conference, as well as to create a space for delegates and interested parties to discuss, to ask questions about past processes, to get a sense of what has worked and what is required for success next year. So in many ways, we're hoping to be able to sustain a dialogue in this area moving forward. To aid in this process, today we have two BWC conference veterans, want of a better phrase, who will be able to discuss some of their experiences and share insights into the review conference process. First is Ambassador Paul van den Ijssel. Ambassador van den Ijssel is currently permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the OPCW and the ICC. Ambassador van den Ijssel was also the president of the 7th BW Review Conference in 2011, and therefore can provide some particularly unique insights into the preparations, the process, and the politics of these important events. I'm also delighted to be joined by Professor Marie Chevrille. Marie is Professor of Public Policy at the Department of Public Policy and Administration at Rutgers University, Camden. And as I found out earlier today, Marie has participated in the 2nd, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th BWC review conferences. She has also followed these meetings of the convention closely, providing analysis on various past events. She is moreover also the formerly the chair of the Biological Weapons Prevention Project and has written extensively in this area. Both the panelists will be speaking in their personal capacity, and I'm delighted they've been able to join us for this event. So thank you to both of you. In terms of how this event will operate, rather than PowerPoint presentations, we want to try and have more of a conversational approach to this. So we'll have a series of questions to our panelists. And to do this, we're quite constrained for time. So rather than take oral questions, if there are points you'd like to raise or questions you would like to ask, please do use the Q&A function to submit written questions. This should be located at the bottom, in the bar at the bottom of the Zoom window. So please click and enter your question in there. If you would like me to attribute the question, that is, if you are happy for me to explicitly name you as the source of the question, then please type in your name as well. Otherwise, I will not identify the person that has sent the question. Other participants should not be able to see your questions, and we'll try and get to as many of these as possible, but because we have limited time, we can't make any promises in that regard. One other point, just before we start off, please don't feel you have to wait until the Q&A session has begun. Please feel free to submit questions at any point. So without further ado, I'll now move to the first question, and I'd like to begin perhaps with Marie and then turn to Paul, if I may. And that is, are there particular approaches or practices or tools that you feel have worked well in past Biological Weapons Convention review conferences? Or are there practices that are perhaps not so useful to repeat? Marie, if I can perhaps start with you, then I'll pass over to Paul.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you so much for this opportunity to participate in this conference or whatever, meeting or group, whatever you'd like to call it. And I think there are two keys to approaches. And the first one, and I'm sure other people agree with this, is that lots and lots of preparation. And including in that, I think that in terms of preparation, delegations need to have very serious engagement with scientific and technological experts who understand the minutiae of biology, and particularly its subfields of neurology and virology. And second, I think it's really useful for delegations to have an understanding of the history of the implementation of international arms control agreements in general, and the BWC in particular, because that will help them understand paths to follow and paths to reject in terms of the actual conference. And then thirdly, I think a realistic acceptance of the political constraints that delegations operate under. I think sometimes in my world, in the NGO world, we don't necessarily understand that as well, or very well. And second, I think it's also important to think about creativity and what's possible in any review conference, but also to think farther ahead into the future and consider proposals that you don't think will have much chance of being adopted, but they need to be introduced so that delegations can go back to capitals and have some time to ponder what would be the consequences of various measures that can be circled back to under different geopolitical circumstances.
Okay, thank you, Marie. Okay, if I can pass the question over to you now, Paul. You have the floor, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure being here. And I approach a little bit the questions from the perspective of the chair of the 7th RevCon. So it will be, let's say, a little bit general diplomatic notions I'll be sharing. But what worked well in the past for me? Well, first of all, what is important is start preparations early. I started them as the incoming president a year before the conference, and to have a lot of bilateral contacts, including in capitals. The latter is especially important because, I mean, from my experience, in many capitals, the BTWC is not on the top list of priorities. So it takes a little bit of time to get them involved. And the earlier they are involved, the better it is, and that avoids surprises at the RefCon itself. I also had intensive contacts with regional groups. That is not so much on substance, but I found it important that as the president, incoming president, that I could share my agenda, my approach with them. So to avoid surprises and thereby gaining trust. Trust and distrust are always very important elements at conferences. So to make sure to everyone what was going to happen, that no one felt like being either not part of the game or being taken by surprise. What I found particularly important, and again, this is not something exclusive to the BTWC, is that in the end, it's not the president who owns the conference, it's the state parties that own the conference. And it's the state parties that should be co-owner, preferably of success. And that's something which takes a little bit of time, but it's important that you create that as a chair. What I found particularly important for myself, but which is also very important for state parties, is that you have a clear idea of where the problems lie. Normally at my review conference, the 7th review conference, there were not that many, but they were difficult. And I think they are still there. Problems like, what are we going to do with the intercessor process? What are we going to do with the ISU? Try to limit the number of problems, have a clear idea what the problems will be, so you can work on solutions, on answers to that. What worked well and what I still think is the practice in the BTWC is to have a split between the review part and the forward-looking part. I think that worked very well. And as a last point, and I think Professor Chevrille also pointed out to that, it is important that there are a lot of exchanges, seminars, whatever you have, where diplomats interact with scientists, NGOs, and industry. So that especially diplomats get a feel of what is the real world, what is possible and what is not possible. I think I stopped there. There are many other things, but these are, I think, the most important things that work well, at least then. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and indeed, thank you both there. I think your comment on sort of identifying problems and finding solutions to problems is particularly pertinent, and it kind of leads to my next question, which is what challenges are likely to be encountered at the BWC Review Conference, and are there lessons for successfully responding to some of these issues that could reasonably be anticipated? Perhaps if I can start with you, Paul, and then I'll turn to you, Marie.
Okay, thank you. What challenge? And again, I have put it in a bit of a general framework because I lacked the knowledge of detail of what's actually being discussed in Geneva. But let me say that it is important, an important challenge, even a risk, is the lack of goodwill. And the lack of goodwill towards a president, towards one another, can come from many different sources. It can come from previous conferences. I mean, in my case, and I'm sorry, I'm taking you really now down memory's lane. We had a month before the RefCon, we had a failed CCW RefCon, and there was a lot of bad blood. So that's a bad omen. But we managed. I don't think the CD is something where there are a lot of successes, so that can have a negative effect. But so lack of goodwill is a challenge. Trust or distrust, as I said, in the president, in each other. Another lesson I learned myself is that despite all the good preparations, despite all that you have a good idea of what will be the problems, there always can be something unforeseen. And it's very difficult to prepare for the unforeseen, but just take it into account that it can happen. In my case, it was the budget of the ICC, of the ISU, sorry. And that's not big money, but yet it was a problem. And we live in difficult financial times. So again, budgets can be sensitive things. So I would advise the president and states parties to have a look at that as early as they can. As I said, bad atmosphere and other multilateral fora, like, for example, at the present Opcw, may spill over. an important challenge is that you organize, and again, this is something the president does, but states parties have a say in this, organize time for sufficient real debate. General debate is not real debate. General debate is me saying how I want to see things, but it's not me listening to others. So organize moments for real debate. Partly a job of the president, partly something states parties can do themselves. Compromises are not found normally in general debates. And then, of course, the major challenge, and maybe later I will say something, is of course the major balances, or the major challenges, mainly for the president, but also for the states parties, where to strike the right balance between ambition and consensus. I think this is one of the key questions always in multilateral diplomacy, but it's also for REFCON particularly important. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I might come back to you on the point on financial preparations later, but if I could perhaps hand over to you now, Marie, for your responses to challenges likely to be encountered and lessons for successfully responding to some of these issues.
Thank you, Jamie. I think that the pandemic that we're under raises possibilities for lots of challenges. And on the one hand, the disease of the impact of the disease itself could kind of go either way in terms of either highlighting the importance of the BWC or diminishing the importance of the BWC. So there's sort of one tack is to say, well, why spend time worrying about the deliberate use of BW when the empirical record indicates that we may worry too much about deliberate disease and not enough about natural or accidental outbreaks. I think that we really need to make sure that the connection between natural outbreaks and the possibility of nefarious uses of biological agents or toxins is really, they're hand in hand, they're not separate issues. On the other hand, the experience of COVID-19 and what it has wrought may bring greater attention to the BWC and how to avoid the deliberate use of BTW. And I think there's a second way in which COVID impacts the review conference or may impact the review conference, and that's the economic damage that it has wrought across the world, further constraining resources at all levels, national and international, for progress in the BWC. So as Ambassador Van den Ijssel mentioned, resources for the ISU was an issue in the review conference that he chaired, and that is likely to come up again with the constraint on general resources. Third, I think that given that the intersessional process has gone on for nearly 20 years, or it will have gone on for nearly 20 years since at the time of the review conference, the topics that have been considered, I think there's a question is, have those topics become stale and repetitive? Does the intersessional process still have the same kind of vigor and engagement that it did in the earlier years? And I think that a review of how to make sure that if there is an intersessional process, and I worry about that as well, that it is somehow reinvigorated. And those, I think, are three of the challenges, the substantive challenges from my point of view.
Okay. Thank you, Marie. Could I also encourage all participants, if you have questions or there are points, comments you'd like to raise, please do submit these in the Q&A function at the bottom of the bar, or the chat function, and then we can pick up on those shortly. But before that, I have another question here, which is for both. which is suggestions for the role of office holders, states parties, the ISU and civil society. What can, should these various different entities do in preparation for a successful review conference? Are there things you think that are really important or essential for these different organizations? And perhaps, Marie, can I start with you, then I'll turn to you, Paul.
Yes, I think that these are generalizations, and so I want people to understand that there are clearly lots of things that each can do, but I think that that there are different roles that we all play, and all of those roles are important in terms of leading to elements of success. I'll put it that way. And I think that in some ways there are, when I talked about the two different approaches in terms of preparation, and in mind of Ambassador Van den Iesel's comments, office holders and states parties are more likely to contribute to the first approach. Lots and lots of preparation, engagement with stakeholders, and bringing a historical perspective to their actions at the review conference. They also often have a broad focus on an array of arms control agreements and other competing policy arenas. And that perspective lends them an expertise in their ability to borrow aspects of what works in other fora that could be adapted for the BTWC. And I think that that's something that civil society doesn't necessarily contribute. Civil society, I think, over the years has made contributions to creative proposals. To use a biological analogy, civil society has sometimes been about keeping one's nose to the grindstone, feet to the fire, and eyes on the prize. We are continually trying to bring the focus of the importance of the BTWC to the attention of more and more of the stakeholders that are affected by it. And as Ambassador noted, the BWC is often a low priority for attention, not only among arms control and disarmament agreements, but in terms of diplomatic portfolios among office holders and states parties. And so I think that once again, civil society can continue to raise the issue of the BWC and the danger of biological and toxin weapons. The ISU, given its constraints in terms of personnel and budget, I think has done a remarkable job in contributing to both and acting as a bridge in some ways between office holders, states parties, and civil society, that it can play that communication role. And I think that Ambassador Van den Ijssel noted that trust and goodwill is important, and I think that that extends beyond the states parties to civil society as well. And I think the ISU, to the extent that it is trusted by office holders and states parties, can often lend credibility to civil society actors that we are not necessarily the sabots in the machinery that we are sometimes considered. And I think that there needs to be a recognition among the different stakeholders of the BWC that we each have a different source of power and different ways of wielding it, that civil society is not constrained by the diplomatic finesse, let's put it that way, that so many diplomats are able to demonstrate in their particularly their actions in the formal part of the review conference, not so much in the informal. But but we often think of power as people who have power and people who don't have power, and civil society is often looked at as, well, you know, who are you? You're not elected, you're not appointed by any authority. And I think we do have power. We have power in terms of our number, our ability to organize, our expertise, our history, and we have ways of wielding that. And I think that it's important for civil society to recognize the power and constraints of states, parties, and office holders as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Marie. We're starting to get some questions come in, but I think I've had the question to yourself, Ambassador. So the role of office holders, states, parties, the ISU, civil society, any recommendations or advice?
Thank you. Well, let me start by state parties. I already spoke a little bit about what state parties can do, but again, it is important to talk to one another, and especially to talk to one another across the regional divides. So as a state, you have a clear idea of the scenery that awaits you. And my advice, and it was the advice of my predecessor and probably will be the advice of my successors, but it is true. I mean, if you have certain ideas and you have cross-regional proposals, they are so far more effective than if you have the usual crowd submitting something. Try to work on regional proposals, and don't think the RevCon as the place where it all happens. In the end, the RevCon is just the end game, the formalization of a lot of work which should have been done beforehand. Bringing a proposal on the last day is normally not very effective. So share your proposals, be transparent in what you're doing. To office holders and the ISU, I think they are the ones that, in my view, should work on the conceptions. And they don't have to share it necessarily, but they should have a conception of what is possible and what is the desired outcome. And sometimes they can share that, and sometimes they perhaps will not, but it is important that they have that themselves. And I think they should challenge state parties, but also create co-ownership. And they should have at least an idea of what is the desired result. Probably they will have to change that, because reality is not always, let's say, generous to these kind of, but they should have, if they don't have that idea, who has, I would ask. NGOs, they should feed this process, I think, with knowledge, expertise, and with ambition. I mean, they are the ones that have to put the bar high. If they don't put the bar high, who does? And I think they should also be a mirror in which states can look at themselves. They should be critical, but partners at the same time. That is their balance they have to strike. If you are too way out, people stop listening to you. If you are too close, you become you stop being a non-governmental organization. But that's for them to decide where that balance lies. And it's illustrated by Professor Chevrille. They are also the living memory. Many of these scientists, experts are working on this topic far longer than most diplomats. And that's very useful. So they have a lot of experience indeed as well. So in a nutshell, that's what I would see these three parties do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It raises a couple of points which are starting to be discussed in the Q&A section, but this issue of trust, which has been raised a couple of times, and goodwill, and then another sort of related issue of political attention. Are there particular, this sort of deviates from sort of the planned questions, but I think it follows up on this point quite well. Are there ways in which you can sort of help build trust or engineer political attention to raise the priority of the BWC in capitals? Are there ways you can try and create a positive environment or create goodwill and a sense of confidence moving into these events? If either of you want to take that question at all.
Well, I'll start. I think that one of the things that civil society can do is to refocus from how should we trust our government. And since I'm an American, I can sort of speak to that in a bit. And so I think that as Ambassador Van den Ijssel mentioned, it doesn't all happen at the RevCon. Most of it doesn't happen at the RevCon. I think that there are some things that civil society has done that are considered very helpful. One are the daily reports that have been generated for many years that delegations seem to appreciate the digest of what has happened in any given day at the review conference. And there are other things that NGOs have done that are less helpful. And I think rather than focus from the NGO point of view, rather than focusing on what trust or what faith do we have in the goodwill of states parties, to think much more about what can we do to demonstrate our trustworthiness. And some of that has to do with our expertise, is to continue to let people know what our expertise is, and to be sort of fair players in that. And to do it ahead of time. I am now taking part in some discussions like this. They're closed discussions. They're not open to the public with the US government in terms of preparation for the 9th Review Conference. And I think that states parties can, in their preparation, include relevant civil society, and typically that is civil society groups or organizations that they trust. And as I said, it's up to us to demonstrate our trustworthiness. It's not up to states parties or office holders to necessarily make that judgment.
And to you, Paul?
Yeah, I understood your question is, what can you do to create goodwill and trust and to involve capitals? Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, a lot of, I mean, again, from the point of view as a former president, I think creating a good atmosphere is key. And that's very much your job as a president. You can play an important role there. That's my firm belief. It starts with words we often use in our trade nowadays, but yet I'll use them again. That's transparency, inclusiveness. Transparency, I already said it. I found it very important that all states parties, small, big parties, active, less active, knew in advance what the plan was. I mean, not so much a substantive plan, but just a procedural plan. So that's important. Take them along in the process. It's their process, but you are the guide. So I went to all these countries, I went to all the regional groups, and so that's one. Transparency, inclusiveness, as I said, I talked to a lot of them. On capitals, I was privileged that my government gave me enough money so I could go to many capitals, so I could go there myself and talk to them and listen to them. And that listening is also important. Diplomacy is to a very large extent listening, but we tend to forget that. But I listened to concerns and red lines, and that's important. I mean, I tried to convince all states parties that I was not there with any agenda other than making the best out of the conference and do well for the BTWC. And I may not agree with anything countries say, but I listened to them and to try to take away distrust. I was not there to, as I said, I tried to minimize surprises for everyone, including for myself. And looking back, it's 9 years ago, but I think the atmosphere was okay. That worked. I mean, as a small anecdote almost, we started the 7th RevCon on 5th of December. 5th of December is a big holiday, or it's not a holiday, it's a big celebration in Anders for St. Nicholas. And I gave all the delegations a chocolate letter with the first letter of the name of their country. That always helps. And of course, you have all other tricks like, of course, the reception and so on are important as well. But So actually, as a president, there is a lot you can do in this regard, and it is important. Thank you.
I want to follow up on the last point, which is the informal part of generating goodwill and trust. And I think that for many of us, we don't have very much interaction with one another except at the review conference and formal meetings. And I think that the practice of holding side events where and receptions, as mentioned, are really important factors in sort of lowering the diplomatic formality that you see on the floor and engaging with people in a way and absolutely listening to one another and understanding others' points of view rather than trying to push your own all the time.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. I think it's something that struck us as well in doing some of the research for the forthcoming paper is the importance of informal events as a sort of important means for individuals to engage, get different views. I think that's really important. It's also potentially going to be difficult to do that, certainly the early parts of next year. So some innovative thinking may be required there. But if I can move on to the fourth question now, and this ties into some of the comments emerging in the chat, the Q&A function. What do you think success would look like at the 9th BWC Review Conference? And I'd be interested in the audience's views on this, but it ties into a couple of points that have been raised about what would an improved ISP look like, intersessional process look like, something I think you touched upon, Marie. What would an S&T review mechanism, would that constitute a success? What could that look like? Yeah, and I don't know who wants to take this forward. Paul, would you like to take this one first, and then I'll hand over to Marie?
Yeah, I'll be brief because, as I said, I have the benefit or the disadvantage of a certain distance, so I don't know exactly the topics that are in play. But let me just say, in general terms, success, certainly for the president, is to find the right balance, and the balance is between ambition, progress, meaningfulness. And at the same time, consensus. And I think that's in a very general formula what success means. We know we have to have consensus, but when do you think you are there? That's always difficult. You will always be criticized by civil society who said there could have been much more achieved. But that's difficult, and that's difficult for presidents. That's difficult for states parties, and that's not, let's say, exclusive to the BTWC. I think that in the BTWC, let's say, more detailed things are still the position of the ISU and the position of the intersessional process. Well, there are lots of things to improve there, but I'm too far away from it to exactly say this or that. So that I leave to the audience. They probably know better than I do. Thank you.
And over to you, Marie, your thoughts on this.
Thank you. I actually have thought a lot about this in reference to the BWC. And I think that the first thing to think about is success or failure. A review conference is not a binary success or failure. And I think that we often think of it that way. And it's better to really sort of think of it as a continuum from extremely successful to abject failure, and a recognition that there are elements of success and elements of failure, and that might be a much more useful exercise. And I actually took down some quotes of comments about previous review conferences from the early days. And I guess I would like to take this opportunity to honor Julian Perry Robinson, who had this to say about the very first review conference in 1981. And keep in mind that that was shortly after the Sverdlovsk incidents of an outbreak of anthrax, which was ultimately tied to a BW lab in the Soviet Union. And Julian said that the Sverdlovsk allegation very much affected the content of the final declaration on the thorny issue of the consultative committee. this was an effort to improve Articles 5 and 6 in terms of dealing with allegations of misuse. And he says that on the one hand, it illustrated most graphically the need for some form of international verification procedure. On the other hand, it suggested that the USSR would be the subject of the very first complaint to be brought before the committee, and few states were happy to contemplate the political furor that would ensue. So paradoxically, it strengthened the position of the Soviet Union. And then moving to the third review conference, it was actually, I wrote this in an article, and that was the review conference where the very first information exchange, or what has been called confidence building measures, were introduced. And I said the degree to which one can term the review conference a success depends on how well the state's parties respond to its dictates. And so it wasn't a question of establishing the information exchange in the form of the confidence building measures, but whether or not people actually participated in that exchange. And that was not, particularly in the early years, was pretty dismal participation. And third, Nicholas Sims had this to say about the fifth review conference. If this was a success, it was a very modest one. If it was a failure, it was not as disastrous as it might have been. The fifth review conference, you may recall, is the one that was bifurcated between 2001 and 2002. And the US had rejected the protocol, the verification protocol, and the very way of introducing or considering verification for the BWC. And at the same time, it introduced the yearly meetings of experts and the intersectional process, which in retrospect was termed, was considered, I think, a great success. So I think that Paul sort of hit on a very important feature, which is setting expectations. And paradoxically, if you have very great expectations and optimism for the outcome or achievements of the review conference, the greater the likelihood is that it will fall short of expectations. On the other hand, if you don't have very many expectations, it'll be a greater likelihood that those expectations will be met. So I think that the balance that Paul talked about is very important in terms of thinking about what your expectations are. And I think that that in that regard, to think about progress as a metric. What progress did the RevCon make? Did it regress in any areas? Is there a combination? So I think that kind of thinking, both not coming to a quick decision about success simply because there's a final declaration or a final document, is not the best way to look at it, but to give it some time to think about how the outcome of the review conference plays out in the ensuing period of time. And finally, I want to just bring up consensus, because the decision mechanism in the review conferences is by consensus. It's almost a recipe for minimal achievements, to get every single state party to agree to something. On the other hand, any kind of alternative decision-making, as you see in other fora, could lead to bitterness, accusation of a group of states parties ramming something down the throat of the others, leading to the kind of discord that can be so destructive. And ultimately, it could lead to withdrawals from the convention. So I think that it would be useful to think about both how to build consensus for proposals over time. And that goes back to my suggestion that proposals be introduced at one review conference and given some time to be digested and weigh the cost and benefits. And then we could also, the conference could also spend some time thinking about encouraging decision-making with lots of abstentions as opposed to just yays or nays. States parties willing to go along with a decision without necessarily approving it. I'm not sure that that would work, but at least it's something to consider how consensus, while it's really important to get the support behind decisions that consensus gives you, it's really a difficult way to get to progress. So those are my thoughts on a little bit of thought on success. So one can think about what's the minimalist definition of success. And one is, as I mentioned earlier, the existence of a final declaration. But second, that at least some progress, that there's some sense that we have moved forward and strengthened the implementation or the effectiveness of the convention. And to hold the line on regression, let's not claw back or make things not as good as they were, and avoiding disaster. Whereas a sense of greater success might be keeping up with science and technological advances and their implications for the BTWC. Part of the difficulty of this is understanding of the implications of technical and complex science and technological advances. And I think a role for the ISU, because they're spending all of their time on this, is to make sure that the communication between the delegations and the science and technology is understood. And finally, to think about how to leverage the existing resources of the group of stakeholders that you identified, Jamie, to achieve greater understanding among them, continued cooperation rather than enmity, distrust, and suspicion.
Okay, thank you. I think some of your comments kind of link to something which is appearing in the question and answer boxes quite a few times now, which relates to issues of compliance, enforcement, and verification, sort of perennial issue of discussion in anything to do with the BWC. I'll try and take a sort of cluster these all together, and then I'll leave people to pick and choose which ones they want to address or not, as the case may be. But there's a question about how could the review conference contribute to verification and monitoring? On similar line, how could the review conference contribute to building support for institutional strengthening of the convention? Then there are a couple of questions related to lessons from elsewhere for compliance, verification and monitoring in the BWC. So what are the lessons from the ad hoc group protocol negotiations? And one here on what are the lessons from the OPCW? I'll leave it with those four to start with, and don't feel as though you have to tackle all of those, but I wanted to put them out there in case anybody did want to take on those questions. Any volunteers to go first, Paul or Marie?
Okay, well, I understood the question as any lessons the BWC community could draw from the OPCW. Yeah?
Yep, that's part of it.
Well, they are, of course, different. It's a different situation. But let me just, having worked on both, I think some good things from the OPCW are, apart from the next to universality, but I think all parties in the BTWC want that as well. So that's, is a far stronger secretariat. And I know the ISU is small because you have to see it in perspective, but still a stronger secretariat. A particular thing which I find important at the OPCW is that we have a much stronger structure for scientific and academic developments. External experts combined in what we call the Scientific Advisory Board give regular advice to states parties on developments in chemistry. And perhaps in the biological field, developments are even more breathtaking and faster and more difficult to comprehend for non-scientists. So there, I think we definitely could do more. I'm not saying the SAB is the model for the BTWC, But I don't think you can expect from the ISU, which are normally not biologists, to have the same insight and as this SAB is. And one thing, and I think this was one of the issues at the 7th conference, and I think we were at that time divided on it. The thing is the possibility for intersessional decision making. And that was, as I said, I don't know exactly where we stand now with the BTWC, but it was a big issue at the 7th REFCON. Some countries were in favor of it, others were against it. But you can't have, basically, I think every 5 years is a little bit limits your possibility. So those are a number of things I think are useful to think about in the BTWC context. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. Some useful food for thought. Marie, do you want to take any of those? There was a sort of cluster of questions around lessons from the protocol, building up institutional support, and how could the review conference contribute to verification and monitoring? So a number of easy questions for you to address.
Well, I think that given that my country was the country that vocally rejected the chairman's draft of a protocol to strengthen the effectiveness and improve the implementation of the convention. Everyone has sort of jumped on the idea that this is verification. And I think verification, that there are various aspects of verification, and the US very much has and continues to see verification as a national judgment on the compliance of others, as opposed to a view of verification as the measures or the activities that are engaged in order to come to that judgment. And so in the State Department for the last 20 years, or nearly the last 20 years, you don't, in the United States, you don't mention verification of the BTWC or going back to the protocol, because at the present time, that is a non-starter. And I think people sometimes forget, but may come back to it, the rejection of the protocol. And the word verification in the mandate for the protocol was in terms of considering verification measures or possible verification measures. And so I think that we need to think about strengthening confidence in compliance. And that doesn't mean the confidence building measures. My old dissertation chair wrote an article in terms of nuclear weapons, talking about you don't want to just build confidence, you want to build accurate confidence. You don't want to be falsely confident in compliance. And so the transparency that was mentioned by Ambassador Van den Ijssel is also important in terms of what countries are doing in terms of scientific and technical advances, what is being done in terms of biochemical weapons, biochemical agents for permitted purpose under the CWC, like neuroregulators, and using those as in nefarious purposes. I think that that we need to really concentrate on what would make the compliance something that we were more assured of, as opposed to doing something like like what was proposed in the protocol, because the institutional rejection of a protocol in the United States is strong and deep. And I don't think that's only true of the United States. I think that there are lots of other countries that were not necessarily vocal about it in 2001, but also may well have rejected the draft protocol. So rather than something as ambitious as the protocol, I think there might be voluntary activities at the regional level, as mentioned several times by Ambassador Van den Ijssel, that would build regional confidence that our neighbors are in compliance with this treaty, and that then those smaller activities could be built on over time. The overlap between the BWC and the CWC, I also think is important. There are, as we all know, various toxins that are on the lists of the BWC, on the agent lists. And the CWC may, did I say BWC, did I misspeak? Anyway, the CWC lists of scheduled agents. And I think that a continued look at what toxins might be considered for greater review under the CWC is something that the CWC could undertake much more easily than the BWC can undertake the kinds of activities that the CWC has both the experience and the expertise to do. That does leave us with bacteria, viruses, rickettsia, etc., to think about. Although the discussion of viruses as whether they're living or not might actually dump some viruses into the mix. But I think that we need to think about what's realistic and try to move forward, as opposed to once again thinking of it as binary, verification, not verification, a protocol, not a protocol.
Yeah, I should point out it's something which I think a number of states clearly feel passionate about and have sort of for a long time supported this idea of the verification protocol, and it was raised in the MX5 last week. But two questions, if I may, from Richard Guthrie, the author of the daily reports. The first one is directed towards Ambassador Van den Ijssel, and the question is, Paul spoke of encouraging real debate, but much debate in the review conference ends up discussing language for the final report rather than discussing the underlying issues. How do we encourage discussion on substance rather than on report text? And then perhaps a question for both of you, but it may follow on from the comments you made, Marie. Is there, and again, this is from Richard Guthrie, is there a common understanding within the Biological Weapons Convention about what is meant by compliance? And how might the review conference help bring about a common understanding? Perhaps Ambassador Van den Ijssel, do you want to go first? Or?
Okay, well, first of all, very, very best regards to Richard. Yes, debate in a review conference is mainly based on formulations. I mean, I think, and this may be too disliked by scientists, that much of the serious debate among diplomats boils down to discussing text. That's how it is. But first of all, real debate. First, you have real debate, I hope, before the conference, as I said, in seminars. But yet you can have real debate in the framework of a text, I think. And the point I was trying to make is that therefore you have to create possibilities. I mean, state parties themselves can create that possibilities by talking to one another, or having little groups to talk to one another. Because normally the formulations, the most lively debates are yet on formulations, but on really serious topics. Again, from my history, there was a real debate on whether or not you would allow the intercessional process to take decisions. Of course, in the end, this should result in a common sentence in the final document, but the debate was very real. And so there are some few other elements I can remember where, of course, the result is a text and you discussed on the basis of a text, but yet it is a real debate. So that was mainly my plea, that normally these conferences are taken to a large extent by general debate, a lot of other things which are important, but also create time for real debate. And not always the president has to create that. And in the end, that should result in text. That's true. But that doesn't refrain from a prior real debate. Thank you.
If I can encourage people, if people have questions, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A box. But I'll hand over to Marie for the follow-up question from Richard. Do you have any thoughts on what do we actually mean by compliance? Do we have a common understanding of that?
I don't think I have anything new to add. I think I would just echo what's already been said. It's a very good question, but I think it's difficult to come to a conclusion on that. In terms of compliance, very simply speaking, I think that, are you abiding by Article 1 prohibitions? Of course, that ignores national implementation in terms of, in terms of exchanges for peaceful purposes. But compliance also involves participating in the information exchange. Way too often, the information exchange is described as voluntary. It's not voluntary. It's politically required. It's not legally binding, but it is politically binding. So we need to refrain from describing the information exchange as voluntary. That the obligation was created and sustained over time. The transparency effort, I think, is in terms of the information exchange, I think is also very important, that the more countries are willing to put their their CBMs or their information exchange reports on website is very useful and should be encouraged, or what portions of their information exchange they're willing to share publicly. I don't know, Richard probably has thoughts on compliance as well. So it would be unusual for Richard not to have thoughts on things that he has questions on. I'm glad you're here, Richard. Good questions.
And I mean, just from our perspective, certainly from my perspective, I think we tend to view compliance as being broadly understood as the positive and negative obligations under the convention. I think it's important that we have that broader view which takes into account not just Article 1 but other articles of the convention, all the articles of the convention. So just a comment on that. There's also a question which has come into the comments box which relates to industry and how to engage industry. What role could industry and other private sector entities play in the implementation of the BWC? And I'd actually like to extend that, because I think that's an important point, to a question to both of you. But I think Ambassador van der Nijssel in particular, you created a industry panel, if I remember correctly, in the first week of the review conference. I'd be interested to know whether you think that was a useful initiative. And for Marie, if you have any thoughts or ideas on how we can bring industry to the table, that'd be great.
Thank you. Well, it was an idea of the ISU, and I think it was a very good idea. The role of industry, as I said, I think it's very important that industry is involved, not just at the REFCON, but in all kind of events running up to the REFCON and in the international process. Because it helps diplomats in getting an idea of what is possible, what is not possible, what is happening, what is not happening. I mean, this is. I mean, the techniques of BTWC is something which is not part of the daily life of most diplomats. Well, COVID is part of the daily life, but so. And the industry seminar, in my view, but as I said, it was an idea of the ISU, and I saw the name of Richard Lenane, so he can help. I think the idea was, first of all, to again give this view, this perspective of industry as a message to all the delegates. We're not working in a kind of ivory tower. I mean, there should be some sense in what we're doing. And second, also to invite, to give again, to show to industry that they have a place in the BTWC community. This is not something alien or strange or dangerous. This is, in a way, we see them as a partner. I mean, that was then the idea, but I assume that is still the idea. We see them as the partner in avoiding the abuse of bioscience. in a nutshell, I think that was the idea. So yes, it's useful. Yes, it should be repeated. And yes, industry should be part of the deliberations, and diplomats should also listen to the ideas and also sometimes the concerns of industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Marie, is there anything you want to add on?
I guess,
your experience?
you know, I've spent a long time in meetings with industry, and I think that there are two keys to successful interaction with industry. One is recognizing the reluctance of industry to engage in something that is dealing with weapons. That the common view among industry is we don't have anything to do with the BWC. We don't have anything to do with weapons. We make medicines, or we make vaccines, and this doesn't have anything to do with us. And the second is to understand that they feel that way. And in fact, as someone in industry once said, you know, an hour away from the lab is an hour wasted. So that they are, the constraints on their time limit their engagement with the BTWC. I think the key to engaging industry is finding a patron who understands the importance of the BWC and has weight within the industry community to bring the industry into the process. I think that if we can identify people historically that have lent support to the BWC, and there are people out there that have done that, to say, you know, we really need you to convince members of industry that this is the importance of this convention, and engaging with the diplomats who don't necessarily understand the state of the science. And you can be really helpful to the BTWC. It's not a question of accusing industry of making weapons. It's a question of industry recognizing that they have a role to play that will strengthen the convention and make the deliberate use of BTW less likely. In other words, call on their civic pride in not just making vaccines and medicines, but also to prevent the misuse of their work.
Thank you both. Thank you, Marie. Okay, so there's a couple of other questions I wanted to follow up on now, and perhaps if I can direct these separately. So we've had a question from Krishna Pushkar from Nepal, to direct it towards you, Marie, on the strategic role and the duties of developing nations in effective enforcement of the Biological Weapons Convention, and how developing countries can utilize more effectively the multi-layered and intergovernmental instruments. So there's one there for you, and then there's a sort of, not one on my list, but one I thought might be interesting to discuss, is on the duration of the review conference. So most review conferences have typically been 3 weeks duration, with the exception, I believe, of the fourth review conference, which was 2 weeks to make way, or perhaps because the focus was on the work of the ad hoc group. But I wonder whether you think 3 weeks is essential, or could it be shortened down? Because there has been some discussion around that in various forums recently. Perhaps if I put that question to both of you, and then whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll start with Krishna's question. What essentially, in view of COVID, what can smaller countries with limited resources contribute effectively? And I think that a key point is for smaller countries to continue to make their presence known, and to recognize that particularly smaller countries that are impoverished, that the effects of a deliberate disease could fall very heavily upon them, and to make sure that the larger communities understand that. The second way to effectively contribute is to make use of all of the materials that are out there in terms of books and articles and really understanding the depth and history of this convention and what can be done, and to understand the scientific background. I know that Malcolm Dando has written a number of books, and he has really made an effort to make that understandable to all of us who are not bench scientists. And third, to invite experts to join with you either virtually. I think one of the benefits of COVID is how many of us are engaging in the way we are today, virtually, with participation from lots of perhaps many more people than would actually be able to make it to Geneva. And that can be organized very easily and very cheaply. As someone who's now teaching twice a week using Zoom, I've been really pleasantly surprised that it has been as effective as it has been. And I think there's lots of room for that, and really costs no money to have short educational and brainstorming sessions with people from different perspectives to generate ideas that would then feed into the PrepCom, that would then feed into the review conference. So I think there's a lot of opportunity if there is, once again, sort of a someone in the diplomatic corps who really takes the initiative and pushes some of these ideas of how to be more engaged and more effective. I thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
And over to you, Paul. There's the question on the duration, but also on the role of developing countries as well.
Well, I have, let's say, on the duration, yes, it has been an issue for quite a while now, and it's always good to look at efficiency. But let me make a few, let's say, remarks. First of all, we talk about a 1 in a 5-year event. So you may win a few days, but it's not the end of the world. That's not an argument to because otherwise you could also say let's meet for 4 weeks. But I think for success or not, a day or more is not decisive. In an ideal world, as I said in one of the earlier interventions I made, you hope that much of the work is done at the moment you arrive at the REFCON, and only on a few points you need further debate, further discussion, and then you end with a success, or with a result at least. But there are important things. Although I'm not a fan of long general debates where everyone is repeating what you already know, they say, but still for many of our political masters or even senior civil servants, a general debate is often the reason why they come to kind of conference. So in order to interest the wider world in what we're doing, the general debate has some importance. Second, there are side events. There is the international process, but yet I think most side events center around the REFCON. So it's not the annual, but the big market of bioscience and everything on biological weapons, and these side events take time. So I have no problem with efficiency, but let's not forget that all these things like sometimes the general debate and the side events have a role to play as well. So I would be careful saying out of hand, let's limit it to 2 weeks. So that's basically my comment. On the developing countries, I missed the question. I'm awfully sorry.
Okay, I need to go back and find it now, but there's a question on what role could developing countries play, and how could they be sort of almost empowered to integrate and use some of the tools in the BWC and become more closely involved, I think.
Well, that's partly, of course, as I said, I mean, departing from a very inclusive approach, they have as much voice as anyone else in the room. I think sometimes the problem is that not necessarily developing countries, but smaller countries sometimes have little resources back home and also in Geneva. So they basically come with very small delegations, and they start preparing, perhaps due to other priorities, a bit late. And that, of course, leads to perhaps a less prominent role during the conference. but they have, I mean, in the end, it's also up to these countries themselves to start early, come with proposals, and be active in the discussion. But I see the problem there. I mean, not every country has the resources. And yeah, as one of my former political bosses said, if you're a small country, you have a lot of abroad. So that's for foreign ministries a lot of work. But anyhow, that would be my answer. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you both. I have a couple of questions here. One question on the informal consultative groups. I'll read it out. The WEOG NAM Eastern Group reflect Cold War politics. How does this structure impact on the politics of the review conference? And is there a better way to organize the consultations among delegations that are essential to reaching consensus? So there's one question there, and then there's another question coming here which relates to how the BWC, the BWC umbrella, if you will, and how synergies and interaction can be achieved between the UNSGM, UN Secretary General's investigative mechanism, the review conference machinery, and then the intersessional process in the future. So two very different questions, but if either of you want to take a go at either of those questions. Marie or Paul?
Well, let's start on the groups. I mean, the groups is a big issue. I mean, yes, the groups are sometimes a blessing and sometimes they are a curse. I mean, I must say I have most experience in the Western group, of course. That's where my own country is. It is useful to meet with other countries and for all kind of reasons, but it also sometimes can hamper a real free exchange of ideas. That is true, but I don't think the BTWC will change it. I mean, it's there. You have regional groups, you have sometimes political groups. It's I mean, maybe I should be more ambitious on that, but I think it's almost a fact of life. I mean, I've been in diplomacy for quite a while, and they were always there. So, but certainly in the UN context, it's as I said, it's sometimes a curse, but it's there. I'm sorry, I have not a real solution to this problem.
Marie, you
well, I'll just touch on that quickly. It seems to me that there are it continues to perpetuate Cold War divisions, which may no longer fit as well as they did during the Cold War. You know, one way to look at it is ideologically or geographically. Geographically doesn't really work because nothing necessarily unites Asia, for instance, other than geography, and you have to have some sort of agreement in terms of perspective to come up with groups. So the NAM is so large that it would be it's difficult for the NAM to function beyond its leaders or its larger participants in the NAM. So I think it's historical, and I think that it would be, I haven't thought about this systematically in terms of what could replace it, but I think that you would want some sort of a something that bound the countries in the groups other than just geography. As Paul has mentioned, the Western group seems to function really quite well. The Eastern group is and the NAM, you know, without knowledge of the internal workings of those groups, I really couldn't say anything more about them. It's a problem. It would be nice to spend some a long-term brainstorming, considering the benefits and costs of different proposals for smaller groups.
Okay. Thank you,
Jamie,
Marie.
we've lost your video. Are you still here with the
I am still
microphone?
here. I'll try and get my video back, but yes, I am still here. And I suppose one thing worth pointing out, in 2011, I believe, or maybe 2006, you started to see the emergence of different groupings, including the Jacksons and a collection of South Central America states as well. Yeah. I have a question here for Marie, and this is quite an interesting one, which has been very much anonymized. And it said, what advice would you give to the US administration after January 2021? I think it's perhaps for both panelists. I'd be interested in your views.
Well, as someone who campaigned mightily for the Biden ticket for president of the United States, I don't imagine that the BWC is going to have a very high priority. So the best advice is to, make me empress of the U.S. position on the BWC. That's obviously tongue in cheek. The people in the State Department who handle BWC are experienced and competent and knowledgeable, and so I think the new administration should be listening to them, but also listening to those of us who are not part of the State Department that has had people who've been there for a long time. So there's obviously new blood in it in the State Department, but it's not a high priority. And I would remind the administration that the RevCon is taking place, and it only takes place every 5 years. And so you have an opportunity, Mr. President and Ms. Vice President, to take this opportunity to have an early impact on an important arms control agreement that opportunity is not likely to recur within your administration. This is your one and only shot, so make the most of it.
Thank you, Marie. I'm conscious of the time, so there's one more question I wanted to put to you. If others have last questions, quick questions they want to raise, then please feel free to submit those. But at the MX5 webinar last week, there was a discussion on the role of gender. And I wondered if you had any thoughts, for example, on practical steps that could be undertaken to improve gender balance in delegations and to promote gender perspectives throughout the work of the BWC. And I know there's been a lot done in the OPCW in this context, but any thoughts on that? I'd appreciate those from either of you.
Well, delegations countries have their own responsibility, so there's not much what you can do. But as a president, you have vice presidents, and you, at a certain point in time, you may use friends of the chair. And I think it's important also for legitimacy and in order to achieve success that there is diversity. I would rather use the word diversity than just gender balance. Diversity is much more than gender. And if you are, in my view, if you're smart as a president, you do that. I didn't just have people from Belgium, although we are very close to Belgium and we are big friends with them. But no, legitimacy and also it helps. Again, this is much more about diversity for me than for gender. To have people you work with who have a kind of co-responsibility, but yet have a different perspective. So that would be my answer to that.
The diplomatic corps, I think, is less balanced in terms of general than the NGO community. I think the NGO committee has lots of women who have taken very prominent roles in this regard. And one of the things that I have noticed over the years is that some delegations actually invite someone from the NGO community to be a part of the delegation, as opposed to sitting in the balcony with little visual presence at the review conference. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which national delegations could increase their gender and other diversity, as has been pointed out. Other diversity is also really important. Just the visibility of women and other underrepresented groups at the review conference, I think is important. And then once they're there, not to treat them as window dressing, but to treat them as, while they may be younger or less experienced, are smart and have good ideas and are not necessarily bound by the conventions of diplomacy in the way some of the people who've been around for a long, long time have been.
Thank you both. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to begin wrapping this up. But before I did, I wanted to check with either of you, or in fact invite you both to provide 2 key recommendations from the past discussion, or anything else you think that it is imperative for diplomats, for various stakeholders in this conference and the review conference to have in mind moving forward. So if there's 2 key points you wanted to pass on, what would they be? And if perhaps I can start with you, Paul, and then I'll come to you, Marie. Sort of 2 key things, and then I'll begin to wrap up, because I know you have to go.
Okay, 2 key things. Start preparing early. And as part of your preparation, talk to as many other delegates as possible, especially those who you think will disagree with you. That helps.
Thank you. And Marie, you.
I guess one piece of advice, I would go back to one of my very first comments, is that the existence of the COVID pandemic has created all kinds of havoc, but it also is a real opportunity for all stakeholders of the BWC to emphasize how incredibly destructive the deliberate dissemination of disease can be, and to therefore use this opportunity to really engage in preparation for the review conference ways to eliminate that as a weapons system, but also to think about how other mechanisms outside of the convention can contribute to making that less likely. For a period of time, I sat on my university's review board for biological research, and so that there are ways to engage not just through the review conference, but as you mentioned, Jamie, with industry, with NGO groups, not just at the RevCon, but between RevComs, to keep it as a continuous effort to strengthen not just the convention, but all mechanisms to reduce the likelihood of deliberately disseminated disease organisms or toxins, that we all play a role, and the BWC is really only one.
Thank you. And indeed, I'd just like to conclude by expressing my thanks to both of you, Ambassador Paul van den Uysel and Professor Marie Chevrille, for taking the time to speak with us. If I could also extend my thanks to the team that helped produce this event. So there's Emma Saunders and Leticia Zarkan. And thanks to you, the audience, the participants, for joining us and sending in so many really useful questions. You will receive an email in due course from the UNIDIR team requesting further feedback on this event. So if there are things you think we should do differently, things you think we should try and change moving forward, we'd really appreciate your thoughts on that. And I think Leticia, has just put a link in the chat, so you can follow that to provide feedback. And I would encourage you to do this, because it is really helpful for us moving forward. Yeah, as noted, we'll continue to work on BWC related issues and we'll continue to have events moving forward. One thing we have next Monday is a Biological Weapons Convention orientation workshop, which is a series of short sort of briefing discussions on different issue areas related to the BWC. This was originally planned as a sort of primer for the MX at the meeting of experts, but that has obviously been rescheduled again. But I think it still could retain some value into looking to 2021. So if you are interested, this is on our events page. Please do visit the website and there'll be more details on that and the publications we have planned for the future. And with that, yep, I hope we can continue to maintain a dialogue around the BWC moving forward, and I hope to see you all in the future. Thank you for your time and have a good day or night, depending on wherever this finds you. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to address all of you and for your engagement.
Thank you all. Okay, take care.